All right, so we're going to have a little bit more of a variables walkthrough. We have been using global variables, but we need to understand what the difference is between global and local variables and how I can use them. Okay, so up to this point, we have learned that we can create a variable. Normally, we write them in camel case, and they are declared using the let keyword. So what we have been using is a global variable. Okay, a global variable is a variable that is using the let keyword outside of any code block. Okay, so when we're looking, these are code blocks. This is the beginning of a code block. This is the end of a code block. For this setup function, when I look at the draw, this is the beginning of the draw function. This is the end of the draw function. So if a let for a variable, if that keyword is used outside of any code block, then it is a global variable. It means that I can use it, access it, change it, do whatever I want with it anywhere in my code. Now, there are times that this is very, very useful, but then there are times when we're talking about video games that this becomes not useful. Because if we are talking about enemies and each enemy has a health, a position component like an X and a Y value, they got an attack strength, they got a movement speed, they have an image, that's a lot of variables that we're going to start having to manage. And if you have multiple enemies, you have your player, you're looking at hundreds of variables very, very quick. And if we keep those all as global, it would be very difficult to try to keep all those variables with unique names, as well as trying to keep track of what is touching what when you're writing your code. So we also want to be able to use local variables. Now, local variables are variables that are defined inside of a code block. So let's say I want to define a variable inside of the setup. I have to declare using the let keyword, and this would make it a local variable. Okay. Declaring it does not give it a value. I'd have to initialize it with something. So that could be done on one line or two lines. So I can write local variable equals something, let's say 50. Okay, this would equally work. There is no issues with this. The other way that I could write this, I could comment this out and I could write it all in one line if I wanted to do it. So I could say let local variable equals 50. Okay, I am creating a local variable that is only scoped inside of the setup function. That means that if I tried calling it here, so let's go ahead and see that happen, console.log, and we want to log whatever the local variable is holding. Let's make sure we're finishing with a semicolon, and then we're going to run. Okay, so now this is where an error is going to show up. Okay, I get a reference error. Local variable, that's the variable that I created, is not defined. It doesn't understand it. And when I click the drop down or I read this, I'm going to see that it's breaking at line 16. So let's look at line 16. That is this local variable. Okay, now if I wrote console.log here inside of the setup, it gives me a value. It didn't come up with an error because local variable is locally scoped. Okay, that means that it exists only inside of these code blocks. As soon as we go outside of that code block, it no longer exists. Okay, now I could even define here, so let's say let local variable equals hello world, and then I want to log that. Notice I'm writing it exactly the same way. Now if I run this, I'm going to get two lines. I get 50 for this local variable right here, and I get hello world for this local variable because they are not the same. They only exist inside of that code block, so it doesn't matter that I have the exact same name. So this becomes very, very useful if I have an enemy's X position and then I have the second enemy I also have an X position. If I'm using local, then that will be very, very helpful. I can use the same variables over and over again instead of trying to be really specific and not use the same variables, since all of them are global. So usually what we do is, how do we determine between when we need to use a global variable and a local variable? Well, a global variable will be something that I need, say, for an image. We would want to use this if we are wanting to load, let's say the Baby Yoda image. Okay, that would be one, because I have to have a preload function to load the image, and I would load it in here. Okay, so because I have to access it inside of a code block, and then I have to use it somewhere else, maybe in my draw or in my setup, then I would want to keep it as a global variable. Okay, now if I don't need to hold on to it, if I don't have to hold on to the value, if it's maybe I'm just using it to compute something, then it does not need to be global. You do not create global variables by default. You try to create local variables by default, and then if you need to use those in multiple places, in multiple functions, different parts of your code, then you're going to want to make them as global. Okay, now we can even reuse variables. So let's say that I wanted to create a color, okay, like let's say we call one as temp color. Okay, we could give it a value. So let's say we're going to do 230 by 245 by 20. Okay, I could draw a circle with that fill value. So I could say temp color, and I could draw a circle, and we'll do width divided by 2, height divided by 2, and we'll do 50. Okay, now let's say that I wanted to define a different color. Actually, let's do this a little bit bigger. Let's say I wanted to define a different color. I could take that same variable and give it a different color, 20, 135, and 220, and give it a fill for a different circle. Okay, so we'll make one that's a little smaller, but it's still centered in the middle. I divide by 2, and let's do 70. Okay, now if I run, see how we have two separate colors, but I've only used one variable for it, okay? Because you can reuse variables. The idea of creating a variable in the first place is because it's something that you're going to use in either multiple places, or it's something that you are planning on changing, okay? A lot of times when we are doing our initial setup of stuff, we want to have initial values, and so then we put them inside the setup, and that makes a lot of sense. If they don't really need to change, then we just have it run once, and that's fine. But there are times, and the next project that we're going to be playing around with is where we want our variables to be very dynamic and to change frequently. So we want them to be either specifically identified in the draw, because I don't need to hold them anywhere else. I can have them change dynamically, maybe with my mouse position, which is the next thing that we're going to play around with. If I want them to stay static, or I need to make sure it absolutely has an initial value, like the player's lives start at 3, I'm going to set it in the setup, and then I might need to make changes as we're playing the game in the draw. Now, because they're touching both of the functions, it means it would have to be a global variable. So you'd have to define it outside of any code block. So you have to scope it outside of any code block. If I am only using it in one place, then I need to use local. So you have to make that proper determination. All right. Good luck. Have fun.